Hey guys, so welcome to our lecture on reading, follow up to the first one. This will be the lecture for April 5th, I believe, which is Friday. So we're chugging right along. Hopefully my boat is chugging right along as well. So let's get started here. All right, so we talked a little bit about reading, specifically how eye movements play into that whole process. And at its sort of fundamental core, reading is basically the process of translating visual information into linguistic information. You've got a printed visual code in front of you in the form of letters and words, and the process of reading is making sense of that visual code in terms of language units, what we call words. Now, we talked about how eye tracking software can be used to track people's eye movements as they're reading printed text. And we talked about fixations, where visual processing is actually occurring. We talked about saccades or saccadic movements, where visual processing is not occurring. We talked about regressions, which are saccades back to previous words, previous letters that we have read in a sentence. And hopefully you did the activity where you saw just how important regressions are for comprehension. So I want to briefly talk about how reading can go wrong, how we can run into some pretty big issues turning visual codes into linguistic information. So let's start with that. So I want to talk about dyslexia. And dyslexia has been portrayed quite a bit in pop culture. It's probably something that you are at least somewhat familiar with. Maybe you've heard it talked about in a movie, a TV show. Maybe you know someone who suffers from dyslexia. Maybe you have suffered from it in the past yourself. Maybe you still do. It's a fairly well known disorder. Now, dyslexia is a learning disability. It is specifically an information processing disorder. It is not an intelligence disorder. So, what this means is that other cognitive abilities are relatively unaffected. So, the only deficit is with reading. People who suffer from dyslexia are not dumber than the average person, they just have reading difficulties. Some of the classic symptoms that come along with dyslexia would be poor word recognition, poor phoneme transcription, which is turning visual printed letters into sounds, and poor spelling. All right, so dyslexia is unfortunately a somewhat widespread disorder, and it affects quite a few children, especially early on in life. And the vast majority of children that are identified as LD or learning disabled in the public school system, um, 80 to 90% of those children are impaired in their reading abilities. So, reading is not the end all, be all cognitive skill, but it is an extraordinarily important cognitive skill in the 21st century in the United States. It is absolutely something that is important in schools. It's something that's taught very heavily in schools. So if you're struggling with reading, it's a good bet that teachers are going to identify you as learning disabled, as LD. And unfortunately, um, a large portion of children who do have this dyslexic diagnosis will continue to carry that diagnosis with them through their adulthood. About 70% of kids who have this diagnosis early on will remain dyslexic as adults. However, there is good news here. The first step and the best treatment we have right now for dyslexia is to catch it early. To catch it early, provide adequate intervention. Um, if this is done, the prognosis is somewhat cheery. If children have that extra attention when they're younger, deficits can be removed later on in life. But if they're not identified, or if adequate intervention is not taken, then unfortunately it may be a lifelong chronic disorder. And you see this a lot, particularly in poorer income places, lower economic areas. Children may be correctly identified as having impaired reading abilities. They may be correctly diagnosed as dyslexic, but there isn't the parental support on the other side of things outside of school to have this extra help. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the causes of dyslexia. So the actual neurobiology of dyslexia is no different between someone suffering from dyslexia and what we would consider a normal reader, a normal brain. So the structure is normal, but the functioning is where the difference lies. Um, yes, so the environment, an important concept that clinicians have established is what's called lap time. Lap time is kind of just like it sounds. It's the amount of time that an adult spends with a small child focusing on their reading skills. So if you remember, I don't know if you've got young nephews or nieces and maybe you read a bedtime story to them, or maybe you just read one of their picture books with them, that would qualify as lap time. Not necessarily time spent with parents, not necessarily time spent with relatives, could be teachers, could be librarians, but any time kind of one-on-one or in a small group between a young child and an adult focusing specifically on reading skills, that's what would qualify as lap time. And this seems to be a very, very, very important aspect of developing those reading skills. And that makes sense. You can imagine, as adults, we are essentially expert readers, and teaching a child who is a novice reader how to develop those reading skills, it's a very important process of learning. There is a very large genetic component as well. Um, there are some studies that show approximately 50% of reading skill variability has to do with our genetic makeup. So our genetic makeup plays a very, very big role in our reading skills. Now, back to that first point there, normal structure but abnormal function at the top of the slide. You can see my mouse here, right here. So the biggest difference in function is deals with the different duties, the different amounts of activation that the hemispheres have. So if you look at this image on the right side of the screen, on the top we've got the right hemisphere and left hemisphere view of a normal reader. And on the bottom we've got the right hemisphere and left hemisphere view of a child with reading difficulties, specifically dyslexia. So with the normal reader, we see relatively little activation during reading in the right hemisphere. We see quite a bit more activation in the left hemisphere while reading. That's highlighted by these orange and yellow marks here. See the exact opposite situation in a child with reading difficulties. There's more activation in the right hemisphere compared to the left hemisphere, where there's virtually none. So this is something that's been observed time and time again in many different studies. The specific link between why differential hemispheric activation impacts reading negatively, that has not been established yet, but this is a well-known research finding at this point. So what are the treatments for dyslexia? Well, we've already touched on this, but the best treatment we have right now is to find it early, provide that adequate instruction, provide that extra help for those readers who are struggling early on. This lap time where you're getting exposure to an expert reader, again, that goes a long way in helping to stave off dyslexia. Excuse me. So what you're doing during that lap time, that one-on-one time with an expert reader, you're essentially helping a kid, helping a child, make that explicit phonetic map. So you're explicitly helping them make those very strong, very powerful connections between a letter and the sound that that letter makes. So between the T letter and the T sound, the R letter and the R sound, the SH letter combination and the SH sound of sh. So you're just kind of focusing on those relationships, you're strengthening those connections, and hopefully making them impervious to degradation later on in life. All right, so the main takeaway message from treating dyslexia is to find it early, catch it early. But down the road, we tend to see two main categories of dyslexia. One we call surface dyslexia, one we call phonological dyslexia. And these two are similar but different. They lead to some rather different, observably different symptoms. So in surface dyslexia, we have a deficit in what we call whole word reading. So this would lead to pronunciation problems with irregular words, but not necessarily problems with comprehension. So we'll talk a little bit more in detail about that in the next few slides here. Phonological dyslexia, on the other hand, is a deficit in phonetic reading. This would lead to problems with unfamiliar words or pronounceable non-words. So with surface dyslexia, you have a difficulty reading a whole word at a time. In phonological dyslexia, you have a problem looking at the individual sounds of a word and spelling it out loud, kind of reading it that way, sound by sound. So this might make a little bit more sense if we look at Coulthart's two-route model of dyslexia. So in this model, we've got lovely boxes and arrows. So, wait, there should be some text right here. There you go. Awesome. Okay, so let's say you are looking at some printed text right here. That's represented by this box labeled print. When you see those printed words, you have two different routes to get to this end goal here of pronunciation, of speaking out loud the words that you're reading here. One route is the lexical route, sometimes called the direct route, and this is where you're looking at the whole word. You're not breaking it down. You're very familiar with that particular word, and you can see it as a cohesive language unit. You can see it as a whole word. And so that is sort of your key to access the lexical semantic properties of that word. You see a word like print. Let's just say that's our example there. You don't have to read the individual letters. You don't have to read the individual sounds that make it up. You see this combination of letters, and that is all that you need to open up all the semantic information associated with that word. So then you can go ahead and pronounce it out loud. So that's one way, and that usually works with words that we're familiar with. The other way works for words that we're less familiar with, and this would be the phonological route. So we're seeing a word that we're less familiar with. We have to change the graphemes, the letters, into sounds, phonemes, and that is our conversion process. So we have to change the SH letter combination into the sh sound. So we have two different routes to get to this pronunciation, the end goal here of reading whatever it is we're looking at. And these two different routes correspond to the two different types of dyslexia that we know to exist. So, in the lexical route, you recognize the whole word, you look up that whole word in the lexicon, and therefore, by doing that, you have access to all the semantic information associated with that word. And this is really good for familiar words, words that we have a lot of practice with, words that we've seen many, many times, words that we don't have to break down into their individual sound components to make sense of. So this is sort of the route we use when we're dealing with familiar words. When we're dealing with unfamiliar words, we tend to rely on the phonological route, the grapheme-phoneme conversion route. So this route, we break words down into their component sounds, and then we put them together and basically spell out a word sound by sound like that. This is good for regular words, meaning words that have regular grapheme phoneme pronunciations. So a word like cat would be considered regular. Cat, C-A-T, no big surprises there. An irregular word is a word that uses some kind of funky spelling, words that we're very used to seeing in the English language, because whoever decided that words should be spelled the way they are in the English language was obviously drunk or something like that. So an example of an irregular word would be yacht. That is definitely not a regular spelling of a word. If you were to try and pronounce this based on the regular pronunciation of these letters, you might get something like yatched or yatched. It's not the word that it's intended to be. So when we're familiar with the word, we go through the lexical route. We can recognize a whole word at a time. When we're unfamiliar with a word, we have to pronounce the individual sounds and go through the grapheme-phoneme conversion route. Now, here's where we get to our two different kinds of dyslexia. Phonological dyslexia occurs when the grapheme-phoneme conversion route is damaged. So you can't access lexical information by sounding out the individual sounds of the word, or at least you can't do it very well. Maybe the process is slowed down, maybe it's not very accurate, it's not necessarily completely blocked off. So if this route is damaged in someone suffering from phonological dyslexia, they will have a couple key symptoms. They can't read non-words. They make what are called lexicalization errors. So when they see a non-word like heath, they will not pronounce it as a non-word. They are changing it to a real English word that they have in their lexicon, like beef. There we go, there's my mouse. So remember, they can't go through this route. They can't look at these these phonemes here and pronounce them one at a time. They see these printed letters and they look for something that matches up in this lexicon route. The closest thing they have is beef, so that's the word that gets activated, that's the word they end up pronouncing. And they're unaware of that. This is completely unconscious, it's automatic processing. So this heath non-word gets transformed erroneously into a real English word like beef. That's what we call lexicalization error. And they also have a huge problem with unfamiliar words. Because remember, this lexical route works best when you're very familiar with words. So it's very difficult for a word to become familiar if your grapheme-phoneme conversion route is damaged or impaired in some way. Now, people who suffer from phonological dyslexia, they tend to function pretty well on those familiar words, so words that they have a lot of practice with, words that they've been exposed to many times. But they struggle quite a bit with those unfamiliar words. But this leads to kind of an odd situation where someone may not even be diagnosed with this type of dyslexia because they're only dealing with words that they're more comfortable with, words that they're familiar with, words that have a high frequency of occurrence. So it's unfortunate, but sometimes people who suffer from phonological dyslexia may go completely unnoticed. This problem is not obvious unless you're dealing with unfamiliar words. So how do we figure out if people have phonological dyslexia? One of the more common, straightforward ways is to give them a bunch of non-words and see if they make those lexicalization errors. So you might get something that looks like this. Get a list of non-words here, and you have the patient read them out loud, and you see if they turn any of these non-words into a real English word. So maybe they see the word ked, they don't read ked, they might read the word red, or something like that. Nar might be changed to car, fawn might be changed to fun, shid to shin, Dupe to something else that rhymes with oop, nothing comes to mind, nothing at all, nothing whatsoever. Not sure why that one's there. Anyway, so that's the non-word reading subtest, and again, you're just trying to see if they're making those lexicalization errors. Now, our other form of dyslexia, surface dyslexia, this is the exact opposite situation. So this lexical route is damaged, it's impaired, it's hindered in some way. So you can't look at a whole word and access lexical information that way. You have to go through the grapheme phoneme conversion route and break down the word into its component sounds and transform the printed letters into the sounds that should accompany them. Now, if this is the case, if someone is suffering from surface dyslexia, which meaning the lexical route is damaged, this side of the model over here, this usually implies that they can't read irregular words. So our word yacht is an irregular word. Remember, they have to go through this route, so they have to break down the word sound by sound. So yacht would probably be pronounced like yacht or yatched. A word like pint would probably be pronounced like pint. They would try to regularize the word. This is what we call a regularization error. So anytime they come across an irregular word, they try to pronounce it in a regular way. Pint becomes pint, busy becomes bissy. They change the Z sound to an S. Now, when it comes to surface dyslexia, they're typically fine when it comes to regular words, but when it comes to irregular words, they have some pretty strong, pretty apparent difficulties. But even if those regular words are unfamiliar, they should be able to deal with them just fine. Because again, they're not recognizing those words based on whole word. They're not recognizing them based on past experience. They're recognizing them based on basically every time they see them is the first time that they've seen them, so they break down the individual sounds and spell it out that way. So how do we tell if someone has surface dyslexia as opposed to phonological dyslexia? Well, there are a couple tests out there, and this is an example of what's called the PALPA spelling sound regularity subtest. And what you do is you simply have someone read these words out loud, and they don't have this column here, the R or the E. And what you do is you just mark which ones they make an error on. So you have them read this list out loud: effort, break, plank, cough, berry, wolf, kernel, and then you see which ones they make errors on. And if they tend to make more errors on the E words, this stands for exception, or what we would call irregular words. If they're making a lot of mistakes there, that would be an indication that they tend to have surface dyslexia-like symptoms. So effort, that's a regular word. Again, if they're only using the grapheme phoneme conversion route, shouldn't have a whole lot of problems there. But a word like cough, that's an irregular spelling. They may be pronouncing that like cogue, or something like that. There's our friend Yacht again, next to Island. Oh, that's neat. Yacht, Island, Luck. Cool. Okay. Okay. Slight technical difficulty there. Hopefully everything got resolved and you have no idea that there was a technical difficulty. So I don't even know why I'm talking about it. What technical difficulty? Anyway, so here's our summary slide on the two different types of dyslexia that we covered, phonological and surface. So if someone is suffering from phonological dyslexia, that route from reading to pronunciation is going to be damaged on the grapheme phoneme conversion side. So they will be able to read irregular words fairly well as long as they're familiar with them. If they come across an unfamiliar word, regardless if it's irregular or regular, that's where they're going to start to have some problems. Because again, they're trying to read words all at once. They're not breaking words down. They're looking at a word and reading it as a cohesive language unit. If someone's suffering from surface dyslexia, that's where they're going to have problems on the lexical route for reading. So they will struggle. They have to send everything through that grapheme phoneme conversion route. So when it comes to irregular words, that's where the letters and sounds don't match up the same way every time. In an irregular word spelling, they're going to have problems. But if the word is regularly spelled and they are unfamiliar with it, they should be able to pronounce it just fine. Okay, now let's talk about some extra credit. So on this slide here, you'll see a link. You can go ahead and click on that, open up the hyperlink. That will take you to a dyslexia simulation. It's pretty short, it's pretty easy. You run through the simulation. There should be a link at the bottom of the page that link takes you to. You'll have to run Flash on your computer, which may present some problems for some of you. I hope it doesn't. Go ahead and click that link to start the simulation, and you'll get a little primer on dyslexia, and you'll be given a paragraph. That paragraph is meant to look like how someone who's suffering from dyslexia might see that paragraph. So it's kind of difficult to read, and afterwards you'll be asked a couple comprehension questions on that paragraph. Now, the extra credit comes in. You tell me the answers to those two comprehension questions. That is your extra credit. Write it down on a piece of paper with your name on it and with those two answers, and then I will collect them when I see you guys again on Monday, April 15th. Or no, we don't have class then. I'll get it from you somehow. Maybe you can email it to me. I'll have more information on that hopefully soon. Okay, that's all for now. See you later. Fair winds, following seas.